Good afternoon. Welcome to our discussion, Crisis in the Caribbean, breaking down the Trump administration's dangerous actions in Latin America. As many of you know, since early September 2025, the U.S. military has conducted at least 25 lethal strikes on boats the administration claims were involved in drug trafficking, resulting in the deaths of at least 95 people. The most recent strikes occurred just on Monday, with 3 strikes that killed 8 more people. These actions have sparked significant debate and international scrutiny for several important reasons. The first is a major shift in policy. Traditionally, maritime drug smuggling has been treated as a law enforcement issue, primarily handled by the U.S. Coast Guard, with arrests and prosecution as the primary goal. This administration's use of lethal force marks a dramatic departure from this approach, characterizing the conflict as an armed conflict with narco-terrorists. Second, there's much controversy over the legal justification. This administration's legal justification rests on a classified memo and President Trump's determination that the U.S. is in a state of armed conflict with certain drug cartels. However, many legal experts, human rights organizations, and international bodies have argued that these strikes are illegal, extrajudicial killings. Deliberately targeting and killing suspected criminals who do not pose an imminent threat is a violation of U.S. and international law. Thirdly, this escalates regional tensions. The strikes have coincided with a major U.S. military buildup in the region, the largest in decades that's not related to disaster relief, including the deployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier strike group. This escalation, coupled with threats of potential land strikes in Venezuela, has dramatically increased tensions between U.S. and Venezuela, which views these actions as an assault on its sovereignty and a push for regime change. Since the first strike on September 2nd, Congress has been demanding answers. Bipartisan war powers resolutions have been introduced in both the House and the Senate, seeking to end these strikes and prevent the administration from conducting further military action against Venezuela. This week, Secretaries Rubio and Hegseth provided closed-door briefings to House and Senate members while the administration continues to face questions on justification for the overall campaign and the details in the video of the September 2nd strikes. All of this is leading up to 2 House votes on war powers resolutions, a vote to end U.S. involvement in the strikes, and a vote to prevent any military action against Venezuela. Today's conversation will delve into these complex issues, examining what is behind Operation Southern Spear and its far-reaching consequences for regional stability, U.S. foreign policy, and the rule of law. We're joined by Tess Bridgman, co-editor-in-chief of Just Security and former deputy legal advisor to the National Security Council, CAP Distinguished Senior Fellow and former Principal Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner, CAP Senior Fellow and former Secretary of the Air Force Frank Kendall, and CAP Senior Fellow Dan Restrepo. 2 pieces of housekeeping before I turn it over to our moderator, CAP Senior Vice President for National Security and International Policy, Damian Murphy. First, this event is being closed captioned in English and subtitled in Spanish. To access captions in English, click the closed captions button below. Los subtítulos en inglés están disponibles al hacer clic en el botón de subtítulos en la parte inferior de la pantalla. También hay subtítulos traducidos al español. Para acceder a los subtítulos en español desde una computadora, seleccione la pequeña flecha junto al botón de subtítulos, active la opción Traducción y luego haga clic en Mi idioma de subtítulos y seleccione Español. Desde teléfonos móviles, seleccione la opción Más en la parte inferior de la pantalla, seleccione Configuración, luego haga clic en Subtítulos y Traducciones. Asegúrate de que la opción Traducción esté activada, luego haga clic en Mi idioma de subtítulos y seleccione Español. Second, our panel will be taking questions at the end of the event. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. En segundo lugar, nuestro panel responderá preguntas al final del evento. Utilicen el botón de preguntas y respuestas en la parte inferior de la pantalla para enviar sus preguntas. Aceptaremos preguntas en español. Thank you for joining us, and I look forward to a robust and insightful discussion. And with that, I will turn it over to Damien and our panelists.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Laura, and thank you to our online audience for joining us today for this important conversation. Earlier this year, CAP Senior Director Dan Herman wrote a piece pushing back on the administration's false claims that the president had the authority to conduct these strikes that we've seen across the Caribbean, and that this was really about stopping the flow of dangerous drugs. Unfortunately, it's become increasingly clear that the administration's real goal is to push for regime change in Venezuela. This dangerous situation continues to evolve day by day. 3 more strikes were announced on Monday, and just last night, President Trump announced what he termed a total and complete blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers entering or leaving Venezuela. While we know that the actions on the ground don't always reflect the president's social media feed, it's clear that this is intended to be an escalation. So with that, let's turn to our panel, and let's start with Dan. You've been working on Latin America policy for your whole career. Can you help our audience understand a bit the state of play over these past few weeks in the region? What are the administration's goals, and what can we make of President Trump's latest post?
Thanks, Damien, and thanks everybody for joining. Let me actually take a quick step back beyond the last couple of weeks to the beginning of the administration, and 2 very quick kind of basic points that I think bear mention anytime we're talking about Venezuela. And the first is that Nicolás Maduro has no legitimacy as the leader of Venezuela. That was proven by the Venezuelan opposition and their brave conduct in elections that Maduro clearly and overwhelmingly lost. Elections that would not have happened but for the policies of the prior administration, the Biden administration. I think the second is you've got a regime in Venezuela that's clearly not concerned with its own population and hasn't been for quite some time. Country's shed a quarter of its population from a decade ago. 8 million Venezuelans have left Venezuela since 2015. And finally, that Venezuela is a source of transit, a significant source of transit of drugs. But those drugs are destined for Europe and not for the United States in large measure. And those drugs are cocaine and not fentanyl, which you'd get confused by given the administration's rhetoric. So we've had kind of since the beginning of the administration began with mixed signals, tension between Rick Grenell, who's the special envoy for Venezuela, and Secretary of State Rubio. Grenell was the first administration official to actually travel anywhere in Latin America, beating Secretary Rubio to the region when he went to Caracas days after the inaugural. And started with kind of an attempt to negotiate and actually negotiated access for deportation flights and kind of an opening up in the oil sector for U.S. companies. We've seen subsequent to that a series of first designations of various entities that are related or stem from Venezuela. I have a little difficulty in characterizing them because they're somewhat more marketing terms than they are actual organizations. One is Tren de Aragua, a prison gang in Venezuela that was determined by the administration to be a foreign terrorist organization. Another is the Clan de los Soles. Again, another, a lot of experts would contend doesn't actually exist. Organization headed by the Venezuelan military drug trafficking organization. And now the Maduro regime itself apparently is being designated as a foreign terrorist organization. Then you got the buildup that Laura made mention to today. About a third of the U.S. naval assets on the planet are in the Caribbean, which is an unprecedented buildup in quite some time. And then we have this most recent ratcheting up, both the last week's seizure of an oil tanker and last night's declaration of an apparent blockade of sanctioned oil tankers. I think kind of there's 3 principal reasons or 3 drivers that got us to where we find ourselves. One is you have President Trump's desire to look tough, to be able to use the military at his whim. and kind of look tough on drugs. Again, these aren't drugs in large measure that are destined for the United States. So there's an exception, perhaps, of the actions in the Eastern Pacific, because that's more of a flow towards the United States than in the Caribbean. They're not fentanyl. Fentanyl, which was declared by the president earlier this week to be a weapon of mass destruction. Again, in part of the ratcheting up that we see. The second, and I think most troubling and reason, the driver behind this, I think there's an effort underway to expand the lethality of presidential authority, and essentially that the president of the United States, by labeling someone an enemy of the United States, can use lethal force whenever, wherever, and however he so chooses. And then finally, I think what started as bank shot regime change, perhaps this is, I think, more a motivation from Secretary Rubio, whose interest in Venezuela actually begins in Cuba, and a desire to cut off the Cuban regime from support by the Venezuelan regime. You saw this kind of in Trump's first term. Close allies of Secretary Rubio, who served in the first administration and served at the beginning of this administration, reportedly were ready to make a deal with kind of anybody else in Venezuela other than Nicolás Maduro, and the primary condition was cutting off assistance to Cuba. That's the kind of the end game that they're most interested in. And I think the theory has been that you can ratchet up the pressure on Venezuela without directly attacking the regime, and that someone or elements within the regime would take Nicolás Maduro out. I think that's a misunderstanding of the regime dynamics. And I think part of what we have seen over the course of the last couple of weeks is a tacit recognition that kind of that initial pressure that they thought would do the trick has not. And they're increasingly ratcheting things up and getting in a more and more precarious position because of this regime change aspect of what we've seen over the course of the last couple of months. Over.
That's great. Thanks, Dan, for starting us off and setting the table. Let's turn to John. John, in your capacity working during the Biden administration at the White House, you dealt with this regime, and you have deep experience and knowledge on the situation in the region. If strikes were to move forward, what should we expect from the regime in terms of a reaction? And what alternative avenues exist to pressure this regime and strengthen the political opposition to Maduro?
Thanks, Damian. And I want to start by saying I think Dan did a great job of laying out the context and the stakes here. I think what we are seeing, it's important to say, is the tip of the spear of a massive strategic shift that this administration is embarking on that, frankly, is very hard to justify in terms of American interests. The United States is facing a crisis in Europe with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the effort to fend it off that it seems to be on the cusp of walking away from. It's facing a potential crisis in the Indo-Pacific at any given moment, with Chinese increasing pressure on the South China Sea and in the East China Sea, as well as across the Taiwan Strait. And we have an administration that's published a national security strategy that not only says we need to prioritize our hemisphere, including the challenge that we're talking about today, which, by the way, I don't think is all bad. I think Dan Restrepo would also agree is not all bad. We should be doing more to prioritize our interest in the hemisphere. But the particular focus on militarizing our approach to the hemisphere is what is really hard to square with the fact that we have these other much more severe challenges that have a real military dimension to them. And the fact that the president is boasting about having formed the largest armada, in the history of Latin America off the coast of Venezuela really raises the question of why exactly we are going about doing that and what threat we are purporting to address. As Dan laid out, the drugs threat really doesn't hold water. 99% of cocaine production is from 3 countries that are not Venezuela. Much of the drugs that are transiting Venezuela are not bound for the United States. And as Dan said, fentanyl, which is killing more Americans than any other drug, is not really part of this story. So what are they doing and why? And to me, this is why it all comes back to regime change, which has been for a while the unstated, and now I think quite explicitly the stated policy of this administration. And so what I suspect they are asking for, they, the White House, they, the president, they, the National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is military options. And as Frank and others can attest, military options for this kind of problem tend to come in let's call it three versions: small, medium, and large. And the small version of this probably looks something like starting with U.S. airstrikes on key regime targets, maybe key targets they associate with the drug trade, maybe key military targets like air defenses that create a sense of vulnerability among the regime. A second medium version of this might be actually U.S. Boots on the ground, but maybe just in a very small number, special forces conducting kind of lightning raids, that sort of thing, against some of these same targets that they don't think they can action from the air. And then the large version of this, which would be the most catastrophic, which would be a significant military amphibious invasion of Venezuela with the goal of changing the regime. I suspect those are the kinds of options that are put on the table. And I do think we are going to be headed down that path sooner rather than later, in large part because in the history of trying to get dictators out of office, there are not a lot of examples of strong words, angry tweets, and even the deployment of military force without actually using it, compelling dictators to decide to just, in the words of Susie Wiles, talking about the objectives of the Trump administration, cry uncle. I don't think that's going to happen just based on what they have done up till now, which puts them in this I think, pretty strategically awful position of having to either use force and back up the threats they've made, which takes us down, I think, a very dangerous path, or be shown to have been bluffing, essentially, all of this time. And they've put themselves in this position for reasons that they have never sufficiently explained, either to the public and I think, or to members of Congress who have gotten private briefings and do not seem convinced at this point.
John, wondering if I can get you to comment on former president of Honduras, Hernandez, was pardoned by President Trump. He had been convicted and was serving a 45-year sentence for drug trafficking. New York Times reported that over the course of 20 years, he was, played a role in the import of something like 500 million tons of cocaine to the United States. How do you reconcile the stated objectives of the administration's campaign against narco-terrorists with Trump's recent pardon of President Hernandez?
Look, as your question implies, you do not reconcile those things. It is more than anything else what puts the lie to stemming the flow of illegal drugs as the strategic rationale for what is happening. If that is your primary policy objective, you do not take someone who is complicit in massive trafficking of the exact drug that you're purporting to stop flowing into the United States and send them back to their home country. So, I don't think when the president was asked this, he sort of pretended as if he wasn't familiar with who this guy was, which raises a whole different set of questions. But there is no way to reconcile that pardon with the strategic objectives that they are supposedly posing in Venezuela. I think what that action reveals, is that what they have is not a strategic policy in Latin America. It's more of a friends and family policy. If you're a friend, perceived as a political friend of this administration, you get all kinds of special treatment. Massive financial backing in the case of Argentina, which is perceived as being a government that is aligned with this administration. A pardon for someone who is perceived as politically aligned with this administration, even though they've done horrific things, including things that did quite a significant amount of harm. And if you're not perceived as being a friend of this administration, well, we might end up invading your country again, even though we just published a national security strategy that has one tenet that purports to be non-intervention in other countries' affairs. That seems to apply everywhere except in the places where they already have intervened or are contemplating intervening in the near term.
Tess, let's turn to you. Many legal experts, including yourself, have called these strikes illegal. What is the legal justification that the Trump administration has been purported to use with respect to Venezuela? And why does this justification fall short?
Yeah, thanks. I would agree with everything Dan and John have said, that the legal justifications they're putting forward purport to be about drugs in the main, but there's absolutely nothing supporting that in reality. And it's disturbingly looks like a game of legal Mad Libs where they're just using law-like words and throwing legal conclusions that are wildly unsupported out there. And what it is at bottom is the president asserting a license to kill completely outside of the law. So to break that down, they've kind of gone two different routes. And as was mentioned in the opening, there is a still classified Department of Justice OLC legal opinion purporting to justify this whole campaign of lethal strikes. But we know a little bit about what's in it based on what's been publicly reported. And there seem to be kind of two different theories they've stated publicly. One is that we're in an armed conflict with reportedly 24, I'd love to see the list of who they think those are, different cartels and criminal gangs in the hemisphere, and that being in that armed conflict somehow gives us the authority to strike the drugs that are being ferried by people involved in that armed conflict. The second is that there's been an armed attack against the United States. This is also incredibly unspecified. What armed attack by whom, using what weapons? Are they actually serious that they think people buying drugs that are being sold for profit can constitute an armed attack? Possibly that might actually be how absurd the theory is. Again, we haven't seen the actual memo, but these are the kinds of things they're saying publicly. But more often they just kind of fall back on labels. They say things like, well, the president has determined, or the president has designated. This group is a DTO, a designated terrorist organization, which is not a thing that exists, by the way, or an FTO or an SDGT, which are things that exist, but do not bring with them the authority to use force. Those are sanctions that carry penalties, in the financial realm, visa sanctions, those kinds of things. So the idea that those could magically kind of make killing people lawful where it wasn't prior is really disturbing. So just to be clear, ferrying drugs for a gang or cartel is not an act of war. It is not combat, does not constitute hostilities. And outside of armed conflict, since we're not actually in an armed conflict with anyone in the hemisphere, the pre-planned killing of another human being is murder under our domestic law, and it's extrajudicial killing under international law. And that's what this entire campaign has been ever since September 2nd. So, one day, if we do see that OLC memo, we will not have an aha moment. There's no set of facts that could lead you, that are based in reality, that could lead you to draw these legal conclusions that they seem to have been drawing.
The September 2nd strike has attracted a lot of attention here in Washington. Several congressional briefings with Secretary Hegseth, Secretary Rubio have been up on the Hill. A lot of reporting and coverage around the video of that strike. And to bring folks up to speed, who haven't perhaps been following the news, the military fired on two survivors in a secondary strike on a boat on September 2nd. These two survivors were purportedly clinging to wreckage, and then were struck a second time and killed. Tess, can you help us understand why experts in the law of armed conflict are concerned about this strike, in particular, given the questionable legality of its entire operation?
Yeah, sure, of course. And what this one really comes down to is that even if you were operating within this paradigm that the administration has manufactured, right? So they've made up a fake war in order to kill real people. But even if we were at war and the law of armed conflict did apply, which it doesn't, an order to fire on the shipwrecked is literally the textbook example of an unlawful order. So the shipwrecked are considered hors de combat, out of combat, defenseless, essentially. And we know from the facts that have been described, as you were just mentioning, these individuals were clinging to the wreckage of their already bombed boat, right? No radios or means of communication, waving their arms, right, when they saw a plane firing overhead. And this is quite literally the example that the Department of Defense's Law of War Manual uses as a clearly illegal order, is an order to fire on the shipwrecked in circumstances exactly like these. So it helps clarify really the whole picture as well when you zoom in on those facts. What precisely were those two individuals supposed to have done to demonstrate that they're, quote, not in the fight, right? They weren't even alleged to have had weapons, right? There's no truce flag to wave. So it really, I think, brings into stark relief the absurdity of the entire campaign, as well as kind of shocking the conscience, even within this paradigm that they've manufactured, that we're in an armed conflict. So for both of those reasons, I think it's a helpful start for Congress to start looking at the oversight picture, but only if it's used then to clarify the entire campaign and the illegality of all of it, because I think there is a risk that if we just focus on this idea that there were war crimes committed, that then kind of absolves those involved of planning and ordering this, of what's been going on since September 2nd in the entire campaign. Of course, there can't be war crimes outside of war. So that second strike on September 2nd was murder, just like all the other ones have been.
Secretary Kendall, let's turn to you. You served both in uniform and as a senior civilian official at the Pentagon, most recently as Secretary of the Air Force. And in November, you wrote a New York Times op-ed discussing the difficult place that the military are in when their legal authorities, when their legal authorities sign off on potentially illegal orders. Can you help our audience understand the effect that this has on the military when they're ordered into these questionable operations?
Thanks, Damon. Well, first, let me say I'm in violent agreement with the other panelists here today. They painted a pretty clear picture of the situation. The problem that I see is that our military leaders have been trained not to obey an unlawful order. That sounds pretty straightforward, but how do they know an order is unlawful? And this is a really good example of what we're seeing right now. The first thing they do is they turn to their legal authorities within their units. There's a judge advocate normally they would ask. Admiral Bradley, who was the commander for the strikes in September that you talked about, apparently did get legal advice before he committed those strikes. But we don't know what that advice was. Up the chain of command, the president's made it clear that he and the White House, the Office of Legal Counsel, and the Department of Justice are the key, the Attorney General are the legal authorities for the executive branch, including the military. So to ask an officer to say, I'm not going to follow that order because I think it's illegal, when his legal authorities are telling him it is a big lift. It's very hard for people to do that. There's a presumption that orders are legal and should be followed. So you then would have the burden of proof that you are disobeying what is in fact an unlawful order. Again, that's a lot to ask. As effect in general on our military, people have been taken away from other duties, moved to the Caribbean. They're engaged in a campaign where they're killing people that in a way which they weren't trained to do. Really, it's something that's new and different to them. It's a big departure. They're well aware of. They're smart people. They're professional. They're very smart. They're well aware of the controversy about this, and they know there's a very fundamental question about the legality of what they're doing, as well as the morality of taking law enforcement action against people committing a crime, basically, and with doing non-judicial killings of those people. So it has a corrosive effect. It also has a divisive effect. There are some people who will fully support this, I'm sure, but there are a lot of people who find it more than objectionable, morally repugnant even, and unlawful. So you've got that division that now occurs within our military, and they're all looking to the chain of command. The chain of command exists in a climate of fear, where so many senior people have already been relieved without cause, that people know if they speak up and object to things. We don't know exactly what happened to Admiral Halsey, who was the commander for Southern Command, who just retired preemptively. But the understanding we have from press reporting is that he did object to these strikes and that he's leaving has left as a result of that.
Thanks, Frank. These past months have seen a major buildup of forces in the Caribbean, including the Carrier Strike Group, as we've talked about. The recent Trump administration NSS has a strong focus on the hemisphere, and recent rumors suggest a review of a force posture that will align with this strategy, with the National Defense Strategy coming out at some point soon. Are we seeing the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine in action? What message does this approach send to our adversaries in particular? And what impact would force repositioning have on our national security? And I direct that one to you, Frank, but it'd be great to have John weigh in on that too.
I think John should jump in as well. Look, this is the most dramatic departure of U.S. strategy I've ever seen. We have a very consistent strategy for about 80 years through the Cold War and beyond. And essentially through our international alliances, we were positioned to resist, defeat, deter aggression from the countries that were authoritarian that we cared most about as potential adversaries. Shifting our focus to the South America and to the Western Hemisphere makes no strategic sense whatsoever. Changing the priorities of the first Trump administration dramatically makes no sense whatsoever. I think everybody's reeling and reacting to this in the military. They're confused by it. It remains to be seen what it's going to mean on the ground. There are stories now of some fairly significant shifts in the organization of the Department of Defense and the combatant commanders that suggest that they're going to be consistent with this new strategy. It's not good for America. It's not good for our role in the world. And frankly, I expect that in Russia and China, they're gleeful about the strategy and its implications for their freedom to operate in what they might consider their own spheres of influence.
So I won't repeat everything Frank just said because I agree with all of it. And in particular, we're a big, powerful nation. We're a wealthy nation, but we're a nation of finite resources, including finite military resources. And so where we position them, where we deploy them really matters, really has strategic implications. We will see, by the way, a national defense strategy someday. And we'll see the results of the ongoing global force posture review. And I suspect they're going to follow more or less what the national security strategy has laid out to our detriment. But there's one other aspect of sort of the strategic implications I do want to mention, fully agreeing with everything Frank described, which is for reasons, again, that I cannot explain. We have decided, it appears, to import some of the worst excesses and mistakes, frankly, that previous administrations have made and acknowledged in parts of the world that are pretty far from the United States and start to apply them just across our border in the Caribbean and in our own hemisphere. And what I'm referring to is some of the tactics that were made in the early days, that were developed in the early days of the war on terror. Including targeted killings that are not sufficiently explained either from a legal perspective or, frankly, from a perspective of who exactly we're killing and for what a reason based on what evidence. We're now seizing tankers, which is a tactic that we used in the context of Iran. Again, another tactic developed in the Middle East. And we're talking about regime change, which should have been, by this point, a strategic objective that's been discredited based on the very bad experiences that we've had. By the way, even though we are often trying to change the regimes of very bad governments. And that should go without saying. I don't think anyone on this panel is a fan of or an apologist for the Maduro regime, which is horrific. But we have a pretty bad track record when we go about changing a nation's government of what actually transpires in the aftermath and not exactly getting that right. And the idea that we have done this over many years, quite far from home with quite bad strategic consequences, most recently in Iraq, and are now trying to do this just across our border without, I think, fully internalizing and taking account for what will be unleashed if, in fact, we go down that path. I just have a hard time explaining from a strategic perspective, but that's what we seem to be doing.
To that point, with respect to our relationships with our allies and partners, John, there have been reports in the press that longtime allies like the United Kingdom have suspended some intelligence cooperation with the United States in the Western Hemisphere out of concerns that it could lead to extrajudicial killings. Can you help our audience understand the implications of this decision and its impact on national security? Yeah, look, I think there are many, many ways in which the current administration is shredding some of America's soft power, some of our ability to persuade our friends or swing voters, frankly, in the international system, who sometimes are with us and sometimes are against us, to follow us down some of our policy paths, because the sort of power of the example that we are setting in the world has been so badly decreased. And this is just one very obvious example. I think there are almost no countries in the world that are our traditional friends and partners and allies who think this is strategically wise.
And not only that, they seem to be voting with their feet because, as you say, they have to go through a legal process when they share intelligence with the United States that indicates to them that the intelligence is going to be used for lawful purposes when they provide it to us. That usually kind of goes without saying when you're dealing with the United States. Their lawyers work closely with our lawyers. There's a situation of mutual respect and mutual trust. And if these reports are true, and I have no reason to believe otherwise, it suggests that basically countries, including countries as close to us as the United Kingdom, have concluded that we are going down an unlawful path. And not only do they not agree with it from a policy perspective, they're not going to be able to support it with information that is quite consequential and useful to us in many cases. Our intelligence picture is a collection of information that we gather, that our partners, friends, allies gather, that we often share when there are situations that are reflective of mutual interest. And if we're getting less of that information from even our closest friends and allies, that's going to have significant consequences, not just in the part of the world that we're talking about, but perhaps even beyond that, if they don't believe anymore that we are running through rigorous legal processes for how we use that information.
So maybe two more questions from me, and we can turn to the audience. We've gotten a collection of questions come in from folks. Wonder if we could turn back to Dan. We've talked a lot about the security implications of what we're seeing across the region, the legal implications, but there's also a political element to this as well, with Maria Corina Machado having just won the Nobel Prize and in a very kind of heroic escape from Venezuela, traveled to Oslo. Curious if you can just talk to us about how you see her relationship with the Trump administration. She's made some interesting statements over the recent weeks, and just how you see the position of the political opposition in Venezuela these days.
Look, she's a woman who's shown remarkable courage, not just in her travels to Oslo for the Nobel Prize, but her persistence in Venezuela. And her efforts to stand up to the regime, a regime that has targeted her personally for quite some time. She has thrown her cause firmly behind the Trump administration, and has, I think, tied her cause, which one of the most powerful things about her until relatively recently was that she has stood very firmly on democratic principles for a Venezuelan solution to a Venezuelan problem. And again, there's unquestionably a problem in Venezuela, a deep political crisis, an authoritarian regime that does not respect democratic norms. But Maria Corina had been a firm champion of that the Venezuelans needed to solve this, and was and people rallied to her cause. As a result, I think if this doesn't end with decisive action that fundamentally changes the facts on the ground in Caracas, I think she could end up in a diminished place. Unfortunately, in a diminished place, and one in which her ability to be that rallying point for a Venezuelan solution to a Venezuelan crisis will have been undermined. Obviously, again, a very brave leader, someone who has stood up forthrightly to this regime for quite some time, and continues to do so at great personal risk, but has aligned herself now with this administration's approach in a way that could ultimately prove counterproductive.
Thanks. So one more from me, and we'll turn to the audience. Want to direct this to Tess and Frank. As Laura mentioned in the opening, there have been multiple war powers resolutions introduced. And this week, the House is reportedly voting on measures to limit the use of force. Tess and Frank, what can Congress do to take back some of this authority? I mean, this is about the immediate in Venezuela, what we're seeing in the region right now, but there's also a broader discussion, I think, to be had around what Congress can do to take back some of its authority and rein in the executive branch when it comes to the use of force abroad.
Sure, I'm happy to start with that. It's an important question, and with respect to our immediate context we find ourselves in, there are really two different issues. One with respect to Venezuela, which is a war powers issue in a sense, and that is because the threats being made right now, which are already a violation of the UN Charter to threaten an unlawful use of force, those are threats of war against a foreign sovereign that are certainly, ones that would trigger an international armed conflict if that were carried out. And it is absolutely clear in our Constitution that it is Congress, not the president, who has the authority to decide when to take the country to war. But there is nothing that Congress could do in this situation with respect to Venezuela or with respect to the vessel strikes that we've seen to date that could make them lawful. And that's because there is no self-defense justification under international law. And there is no ongoing non-international armed conflict, as the administration has been calling it, with any of the groups that it's targeting. So even though there's nothing that Congress could do that could make it lawful, there are still a lot of things that Congress could do to serve as a more effective check on the administration, and to make clear that there's a reason, right, that the Constitution envisions Congress and not the whims of one man being what directs the U.S. military into action, because that is what we're seeing is the whims of one man directing our military to use force unlawfully. So, one thing they can do is use those resolutions that you were just mentioning to vote to cut off, to terminate the ability of the president to use U.S. armed forces in these places. They need to get to 60, and that's going to be difficult in the current environment. Other things that they need to do to really effectively rein in the administration, unfortunately, you also need to get to 60 votes. Things like a funds cutoff, issuing subpoenas for witnesses. You need some majority cooperation, standing up a full-scale investigation, which is what they absolutely should be doing on a bipartisan basis, getting documents, getting witnesses, documenting in real time what's going on all the way to the top of the chain of command. That needs to be bipartisan. One of the few things that we have seen some bipartisan support for is at least getting the full video of that second September 2nd strike, because it did shock the conscience. And members can be speaking clearly about it and using their positions to do just that. We've seen several members do so, and we've seen a few Republicans as well. We've seen Senator Paul be very clear on these points, among a few others. So, there are a range of levers that they can pull if they have some measure of bipartisan support. And I would hope that the abuse of the U.S. military, putting service members in this unthinkable position, as has been described, and the deeply reckless and unstrategic consequences of these actions might be enough to get a little bit of bipartisan support to start taking some of these actions.
Thanks, Tess. Frank, anything to add?
I would summarize this to say Congress needs to find a spine and assert its role under the Constitution. One of the more egregious things here is the violation of the War Powers Act, which limits the president's ability to use force without congressional approval. The administration is saying that this is a war, so we can kill people, but it's not a war, so we don't have to report to the Congress and get their approval for what we're doing. If the Congress has got to fundamentally stand up and do its job under the Constitution. Tess mentioned a number of things that they can do. They need to expose for the American people what's really going on here. That video, I think, is key to give people an understanding of the types of operations our military is being directed to conduct. I'm at a loss for words for how disappointed I am in the U.S. Congress's interest in protecting its role under the Constitution. That has characterized this entire administration.
Well put. Well put. All right. Well, let's turn to questions from the audience. We'll start with a question from Ernesto Tovar from Univision. And he asks, what is the legality of seizing oil tankers sanctioned by the U.S. and of announcing a total blockade in this regard? Can the U.S. legally and operationally seize dozens of ships and unload their cargo of oil and refined products in its ports and sustain this strategy for weeks and months? I don't know who wants to take that one. Maybe Tess, raise your hand if you want to jump in.
I can start. Sure. And this is a bit of a thorny one because there's going to be a difference between what domestic law might say about this and what international law might say about it. The administration claims, and this is just with respect to the skipper, that first vessel that was seized, that it is acting pursuant to a warrant and that is now going back to court in the U.S. to make its case in a forfeiture proceeding that would then allow it to seize that oil. Even if it succeeds in doing that as a matter of domestic law, which it may well do, the question under international law of boarding and seizing another vessel and claiming the oil or whatever other cargo is on board is a trickier one. Boarding may well have been lawful in this case if it was a stateless vessel, and that appears to be the case. Then there's a much more unsettled question about the extent to which the state that has boarded that vessel can then exercise our own jurisdiction over that vessel and all the ways that this administration is claiming to be able to do. I would be surprised if we don't see pushback, in part because of the kind of naked, clear underlying reasons they're doing this, right? This isn't just about sanctions enforcement. And by the way, they're unilateral U.S. sanctions. It'd be different if we were operating under a UN Security Council regime, which is what happened when a Libyan oil tanker was seized in 2014. But I think we'll start to see pushback if the U.S. is more aggressively trying to enforce its own domestic laws, its own jurisdiction over these vessels. Certainly with respect to a blockade, that's unlawful. It would in fact constitute a use of force, and it would likely rise to the level of aggression. So with respect to seizing some of these tankers and their contents, they might be on okay ground under domestic law. They're on very shaky ground under international law, and a blockade itself would be an unlawful use of force.
Damien, we can no longer hear you.
You'd think by this point I'd figure out how the mics work. Dan, did you want to jump in on that point?
No, I think that was more than adequate. There's an operational tempo challenge also, depending on what this looks like, given the volume of these kinds of shipments coming out of Venezuela. But I think Tess's answer was quite complete.
So let's turn to Jose Delgado from El Nuevo Dia, which is Puerto Rico's largest newspaper. After closing Puerto Rico's Roosevelt Roads Naval Base and the Vieques firing range 2 decades ago, should the repurposing of former military installations, U.S. military installations, and the increased military presence in Puerto Rico be seen as a permanent interest of the military in its use of Puerto Rico, now with Trump's emphasis on the Monroe Doctrine, or a temporary interest responding to a show of force in the Caribbean?
I guess I'll take a stab at that. Look, and I think this remains an open question. I think the national defense strategy that's been made reference to will help flesh this out. That if this is a kind of more permanent force reposturing towards the Americas, which the national security strategy would suggest that it is, this is one application of this sort of change in posture, but not the only one that is, I think, contemplated by the theory of the case that the Trump national security strategy lays down. So I think, and again, we'll get more fidelity on that as the administration kind of lays out more of its how it's implementing the national security strategy, including the defense strategy, and as Frank made reference to earlier, the notions of rejiggering the commands structure could also tell us about what the more persistent U.S. Military presence in the Caribbean may look like. And if there is a more persistent U.S. military presence in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, I think, will undoubtedly have to play a role, just as a matter of geography.
Anyone else want to jump in on that one? Okay. So with this next question, I'm going to bundle, sort of two of these together, and that's really about opening up the aperture on the region itself, and hoping to draw out members of the panel on how they see the implications of what's happening right now with respect to Venezuela for other countries in the region. One of our audience members asks, with respect to Colombia, how do the continuing attacks on the Petro government in Colombia, including yesterday's designation of the Clan de Golfo as a terrorist organization, come into your analysis? Is this about pre-justifying attacks in Venezuela via Colombia on the basis of the purported anti-drug trafficking objective, or do you see it as part of the friends and family policy, but not linked to the pressure on Venezuela?
So the nature of the relationship between President Petro and President Trump has been sour, to put it mildly, and is kind of a four-square example of the kind of friends and family approach, friends, family, and foes approach that John laid out earlier. The kind of test run of U.S. coercive use of tariffs, for example, by the Trump administration globally took place the weekend after the inaugural vis-a-vis Colombia. And things haven't really gotten any better. And quite frankly, there's no reason to expect the bilateral relationship between the United States and Colombia will get any better until, at the earliest, August 7th of 2026, when a new president takes office in Colombia. But I think the designation of the Clan del Golfo, the president's own words, again, sometimes you can overread the president's own words in terms of their relationship to reality and predictability. But the president, every time he has been asked about Venezuela and the possibility of attacks on Venezuelan territory, has gone out of his way to not only not say that that's not an option, but to also mention that the option of the similar attacks or similar strikes in Colombia and in Mexico are things that he might want to do. And quite frankly, I think that's kind of where we're headed here. The possibility of land-based strikes in Colombia, I think, is real during the balance of the Petro administration. And I think, quite frankly, the probability of strikes against cartel targets in Mexico in the coming calendar year is quite high. That I think this is also one of the motivators behind, or the original motivators behind, the strikes in the Caribbean. They were, quote unquote, the easiest entry point, I think, in the administration's concept to use lethality in the way that Tess was talking about, presidential lethality. And again, the president himself has said on a number of occasions when talking about Venezuela that Colombia and Mexico are also on the table. And I think we should take him at his word on that.
So maybe one final question from the audience. The parallels between the invasion of Iraq and the potential invasion of Venezuela seem strong, with Trump declaring fentanyl as a WMD. If that's the case, do you anticipate that the Trump administration will attempt to build a case for an invasion, or do you foresee a quick strike with no attempt to influence public opinion? So I throw that out to the group. It's an interesting question, given that the president has announced that he wants to speak to the nation tonight at 9 p.m. We don't know it hasn't been publicly announced what the topic is. So putting that out to the group, how would you predict that the administration is going to approach this in the coming days and weeks?
Let me take a crack at it, Damien. When I saw the troop movements underway to Iraq, 2004, it was clear to me that decision had effectively already been made. You don't do that sort of thing with the force unless you plan to use it. The administration then and the administration now is going to deny that intent. But once the Ford Strike Battle Group, Carrier Battle Group moved, it implied to me that they were serious about this. And I think what Dan said, I'm sorry, what John said earlier about the range of options, small, medium, and large, does apply. They don't have a large ground force. They have a very small ground force in the Caribbean that could do kind of special operations raids. It could do smaller operations. Can't do an invasion. But we've got an overwhelming force when it comes to taking control of the air and the sea. And also a very strong air power force there that could support any attempt to unseat Maduro. So I think something along those lines is probably what we can expect here. And we'll see what the president has to say tonight.
Anyone else want to add on that one?
I could chime in. I agree completely. And I think in terms of whether they will try to justify it, I think they've already been trying to justify it. They've been laying this groundwork for quite a while as a policy matter and as a legal matter. Their very first report to Congress under the War Powers Resolution, reporting on the September 2nd strike, used terms that don't make sense in the context of boat strikes. They said there were governments in the region that are unable or unwilling to address a threat to the United States that has nothing to do with a strike in international waters. You only use that language if you want to take strikes within the territory of a non-consenting state. So, they've been laying this groundwork on there being non-international armed conflicts with 24 different groups in the region. They can't all be in Venezuela, right? They're in Colombia, they're in Mexico. They've been saying they're operating throughout the hemisphere. They've been saying that they're targeting the drugs because they're war-sustaining objects, which is a controversial theory. But putting that aside, that their approach has been that they're targeting the drugs because the drugs are used by these groups to fund their armed conflicts elsewhere that are a big problem for the region and a threat to the United States. So none of this works legally, to be clear, that they're on zero footing, not only shaky footing on any of this. It's entirely pretext. And for the reasons that Frank and others have said, none of it is sound for policy reasons either. But they have been laying this groundwork since before September 2nd. And I think, unfortunately, it's correct that we need to take them at their word that at the very least, they're seriously considering going forward with this.
John, did you want to jump in on this?
I was going to make the same point that Tess did, and I think it's not just for the purpose of preparing the public for the possibility of military invasion. I think they did believe maybe on some level that they could kind of scare Maduro into backing down. That just feels and looks increasingly unlikely at this point, and so beyond that, just agree with everything my colleague said.
Great. Well, we're a bit over time, so why don't we wrap up? First of all, I really want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today on relatively short order. We put this together pretty quickly given the situation in the region, so I deeply appreciate your time and your insights. And I also want to thank everyone who joined us online today to make time for this important conversation. As we discussed, later today, the House will be voting on 2 War Powers resolutions. These resolutions offer a chance for Congress to reassert some congressional authority and to push back against the administration's unlawful and dangerous actions. So I'd encourage folks who are on the call right now to contact your members of Congress and tell them to vote in favor of these resolutions. So with that, another word of thanks to our panelists and thanks to our audience, and we'll wrap up here. Thank you, everyone.